All right, so I had there was someone asking about materials and how they compared to different um, like they asked like what's the difference between a carbon fiber whistle like a carbony and a PVC whistle like Susato, and I wanted to demonstrate so the material the whistle made is made out of does make a difference, but I think that it the difference that it makes is exaggerated in a lot of people's minds. It is if you could create a series of whistles made of different materials and keep the geometry of the whistles identical. So bore or taper, the blade, angle, and the length, the wind way, height, width, all that stuff. If you could keep everything constant, everything where the air touches, all those dimensions constant, and the thickness too of the material, you would end up with a series of whistles that sound very, 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 very close to one another. The difference between them is in because I like to tell people if you imagine as a thought experiment, if you imagine a series of bells made of different materials, and you can keep all the materials, size and shape, all identical, thickness and everything. You make one bell out of brass, and the other bell you made out of PVC, Delrin, wood, and imagine what happens when you strike each one of those bells. The metal bells are going to ring, and they'll sustain that ringing for a while, whereas the carbon fiber, wood, plastic, those you hit them, they're going to clack, and they're not going to ring for very long. And to me, those are the two broad categories of materials, and carbon fiber would be in that same category. You either have something that's going to sustain a ringing tone, or something that is going to absorb the ringing tone. And I think the absorbing of that's what we would call a warmer. When we say it's a warmer sound, warmer tone, we're talking about it's more dampened. It's not as like if you're in a cold, empty metal room, it's echoey, and whereas a room that is covered with curtains and carpet, soft surfaces, is going to feel warmer. It's got a warmer sound. It's going to absorb sound. It's not going to echo. So we're talking about cold is more like the echoey room, versus warm is a sound absorbing environment. So the same thing goes with whistles. The difference between the bell thought experiment and the way whistles work is you're not generating a tone by striking a whistle. You're generating the tone is generated by the blowing of air across the blade, the sound blade, and the angle at which that's blown, the width of the stream, how much air is going into, being cut and vibrating versus how much is sort of waste air, like the extra wind noise that you get. So how that air is focused onto that blade is very much, and then how much air is focused onto the blade, like the width of the blade, the width of the windway, openings in the whistle, whether or not the sound can escape. All those things go into the sound production, and so the material of the whistle really is just the container for that sound. And so, and the blade, I think the blade and the head construction can have a little bit more of an impact on the sound, because you've got when you're splitting air on this blade, it either can vibrate with the air, or it can dampen those vibrations. So the actual sound production part of the whistle, the material it's made out of, I think can have an effect as well. But again, when you're talking about like I think straight up geometry of the whistle is going to be, that's the number one thing that influences tone. And then you're talking about, like I said, between the two broad categories of metal versus ringing materials versus dampening materials, there's not a huge amount of difference, and a lot of different, like I said, the way people perceive sound is very, there's a lot of psychology that goes into it, where, you know, some people, when they feel like something is going to produce a higher quality sound, then it does for them. The way they perceive it is, oh, it's more nuanced. And so things like PVC, you know, people think PVC, it's cheap. It's not going to produce a high quality sound. It's like a utility. It's a super cheap material, and so they're already sort of, you know, mentally prejudiced against it, and so they're less likely to perceive it as a, you know, they'd say, oh, it's got a plasticky tone. So let me show you some of these. I've got a few whistles here. I've got some high whistles, high D whistles, and then I'm going to go into some low whistles. So I think the tone of the whistle is affected a little bit more in the low whistles versus the high whistles, because obviously the high whistles have less stuff to resonate. The low whistles, the container may play a little bit more of a role in things, but I will show you. First off, they were asking specifically about, you know, PVC versus carbon fiber. So, well, one thing first. So here's my carbony high D, and this is the head that came with my carbony high D, and it is an older head design, and I didn't realize this for a while until I got the high C that had the same size head pretty much. But this is how my carbony sounds. And people say, "Oh, that's, you know, that soft, breathy sound. That's a woody sound, right?" And there is some sound dampening that happens with the carbon fiber. It's a bit of a thicker tone. Again, you're not getting that ringing because it's a clacky material. But look what happens when I take the head off, and the head's made out of ebonite, which is that hard rubber, and aluminum, machined aluminum. But if I replace it with the head that came on my C whistle, again, same body material and same materials for the head. So there's still some of that warmth, the absorption of the tone is happening, but suddenly a lot of that breathiness is gone. That is all a change in geometry. So that had an enormous effect on the tone. No material change whatsoever. And so you compare that. Here are two, I would say they're PVC or plastic whistles. I've got a Susato, and here's a Tony Dixon. And again, same materials on these. So if you're saying, oh, what does a PVC whistle sound? Oh, and a goldfinch. So it's not black, but this is a CPVC whistle. So all three of these are plastic whistles. And you'll see, here's the Tony Dixon. Here's the goldfinch. And then here's the Susato. Versus the Dixon again. Versus my carbony. So you can see there's, especially between the Susato there's quite a bit of difference between these whistles, and again, that's the geometry. So just the G, Susato. Let's see if I can flatten that. I don't know. I'll sharpen this a little bit. Goldfinch. Versus the carbine. And then, so here's a sweet tone. So there's a softer, breathier sound, but there's a little bit of ringing in it. So again, there's a little bit more, it's a thin material, it's a resonant material on the sweet tone, and so it's gonna give you a little bit more, it's gonna feel, for lack of a better phrase, it's going to feel thinner. I found that thin materials make a difference. The thicker the material is, it tends to absorb the sound a little bit more. It seems like to have a smoothing effect. Thinner walled whistles tend to feel rougher to me. And that's been pretty consistent. So the difference between a Clark sweet tone versus another conical bore whistle that shares some of the design similarities. This one's louder, but I think that's going to be due to the bore width on this one this is a wider bore high D versus this is a narrower bore high D, so you're going to get more volume because again geometry changes, but there is a warmth that comes from the carbine because it's dampening that tone, whereas this thinner material is going to be a little bit more resonant. So, here's a Chris Wall PVC. Very soft sound. Again, a lot of that is whistle geometry. So if I go to my low whistles, should be one near the television. If I go to my low whistles, I've got a selection of low F whistles. Again, I've got a Goldfinch, and I've got a carbine, and so one's a PVC, one is carbon fiber. Wildly different geometry in those. And then I've got a Burke, which is actually similar geometry to the Goldfinch, similar, not identical. And then I've got a couple of I've got some aluminum whistles, and then I've got a brass whistle, this Freeman, which is again, this is a narrow bore brass whistle, so you're gonna see some differences. So let me start out. Here's the Carbine F, and this is not the current whistle head generation. This one has a little bit more back pressure, a little bit more air efficient, more restriction on the windway, so it's pushing back more, a little bit thinner tone, but I really like the way that it handles. It's one of my favorite carbining whistles. So here is. Okay, and then here is the goldfinch, which is PVC, but a totally different geometry. Let's see. Let me make sure these are tuned right. Is that one just like jammed on all that? Get one of my other ones that's tuned. There we go. So let me try that again. Or let me see. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Sometimes it doesn't help to compare with wildly different tunings. So the carbony F again. And here's the goldfinch. So again, you can hear the warmth. There's a warmth that's not so resonant, but very different tones. Here's a Burke, which shares some design similarities with the goldfinch, with aluminum. Goldfinch again. So you can hear that there's some similarity. So here, because there's such a close match in the geometry of these, you end up with whistles that sound more similar to each other, even though the materials are very different. And then as far as, so again, here's the Burke. And here's a Reviol, which is also aluminum, it's just anodized. So much more complex tone. Again, very different, and it's geometry. Here is a this is my new JP Lemure low F aluminum with the brass slide. Clogging a little bit. And then here's another aluminum whistle. This one has a like a resin wind blade. This is my Dante. And then here's a Goldie, another aluminum. And then here is the Freeman low F generation style. It's very narrow bore. So you can hear there's a really big difference in sound on that versus any of these other whistles, and it's because there's so many different design differences. Like I said, the bore is narrower, and he's actually making me a new one that's going to have a wider bore, so it should have a stronger bottom end and it's a little bit less sweet on the top end, but the lower whistles probably need it'd be better, I think, with a wider bore. And so, yeah. So I hope that is helpful. It's something it's fascinating to me. So again, there is a difference between materials, but the geometry, the dimensions of a whistle are so much more important than what the whistle is made of. So when you say, oh, what does a carbon fiber whistle sound like versus a CPVC whistle, there's no way to directly compare. There's some general guidelines. Again, you're not going to get that ringing. You're not going to get the resonance the same with a wooden whistle versus a metal whistle, or a carbon fiber whistle versus a metal whistle. But even those differences are somewhat subtle compared to. You're going to get a huge difference is going to be in the geometry of the whistle itself. So I hope that's helpful. And maybe if you're looking to buy a whistle, it'd be really nice if I could have a Burke. I know Burke made composite whistles. So he has them in brass and aluminum and a composite material. And I've actually compared in some of my other whistles the brass and the aluminum versions of the same keys, like the A and I had an A in brass and aluminum, and those whistles played very similarly. If I couldn't feel the difference in weight between them, I'd probably have a hard time blindfolded telling the difference. I think the brass was a little bit less, is a little bit mellower in the bottom end. Had a little bit of sweeter top end. The aluminum was a little bit more full on the bottom end, a little bit harsher on the top end. Again, the differences between metal, they're both resonant things, but the differences between the metals, some metals are denser. They seem to conduct sound a little bit more. They're more liquidy sounding. But again, it's very subtle. If you just handed me a Burke, one day and I played it, a brass Burke, and then the next day I played an aluminum Burke, but I was blindfolded, and you asked me which one I was playing, it'd be really, really difficult for me to tell the difference. A Burke is a Burke. The composite, on the other hand, I suspect I would be able to feel that the sound was dampened a little bit. It probably would be a slightly thicker sounding, a warmer sound. And I've actually heard some people say that they prefer the composite Burks. But again, when you're talking about, like, overall, it's the Burke design that gives the Burke sound. And it's not going to be as much down to the material. Like I said, subtle differences, but if you're blindfolded, like, I would, if you're stressing out, and especially I've heard the debates over, generation whistles, where you have a generation, the nickel plated versus the brass, like which one is better. Some people swear that the nickel are better than the brass versions, and I've done side by side tests, and I couldn't hear a difference at all. And I suspect if there is a difference, the nickel ones come with a blue head and the brass come with a red head. And I suspect that maybe the makeup of the plastic maybe like slightly changes. Either if they use the same molds, maybe it slightly changes its behavior in the molds, and the blue plastic comes out a little bit different than the red plastic, or it's slightly more dense or less dense, or like there's some sort of geometry change that if there is a consistent difference between the blue, the nickel plated versus the red head, brass generations, it's probably down. There's something in there that's influencing the geometry, because the nickel plating might, I would think, if anything, it would slightly dampen the tone, because you'd be slightly thickening the walls of the whistle. But people say it sounds brighter. So again, if you're agonizing over that, I would go for which one do you think looks better? Which one makes you happier? I like the look of brass and with the red head. I think that it's a nicer look to me than the blue and the silvery color, or the blue and nickel plate. And so I get brass whistles. So to me, it's very much it's an aesthetic thing. If a wooden whistle makes you happy, the way that it looks, and the feel of wood and the naturalness and the harmony with nature and all that stuff, then get a wooden one. But if you're worried about maintenance, I mean, that's the reason I got the McManus Ebonite. I asked Roy McManus, I said, is there a difference between your wooden, like a blackwood high D, and an ebonite high D? Is there significant difference between the two? And he said they sound about the same. So from the maker himself, a McManus sounds like a McManus. I suspect that if you lined up a bunch of his whistles, they're handmade, so each one is going to have some subtle geometry differences. But if you lined up a bunch of McManus whistles and you had some blackwood mixed in, 10 blackwoods and 10 or various woods mixed in with some ebonite whistles, if you couldn't feel the difference between the materials or the weight or whatever, I think that you would probably it'd be difficult to, the differences would be subtle. You might be able to pick them out, but again, they're all great. They're all going to be really nice whistles. But the differences in material, it's going to be a very subtle thing. So anyway, I hope that helps. It's kind of a long video.